All right, welcome to the Sermon Recap Podcast. I am Pastor John here with Pastor Mitch.
That's me.
Yeah, sorry. It's a little different, so we're trying this out. But we are going to jump into Mark chapter 3 today, verses 1 through 6. I'll go ahead and read it, and then I'll kind of just pass it to you to kind of set the scene for us.
Sounds good.
All right. Again, he entered the synagogue, and there was a man there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So, Mitch, where are we? Set the setting for us.
Yeah, so we started off yesterday's sermon, and I wanted to be very intentional. I mentioned this, but I actually woke up in the morning and I was like, I just want to make sure that we all understand the context of this story, because I think something that happens when we read the Bible, something that happens for a lot of us that we've grown up in the church, we can visualize these things right away. Like I was even talking to my wife, JC, last night, and she said, I don't know that I've ever heard someone preach a sermon on this passage and lean so much into the Pharisees. And so that's even like starting with a base knowledge that like you've heard this passage preached before. It's a story that you know, and that's not true for everyone. And so we spent, a portion of the sermon really trying to make sure we set the setting well, to understand this story. And so it takes place in a synagogue. The synagogue, again, you have to think there's the temple, and then there's synagogues. And so I didn't even share this part of the details yesterday, but the synagogues they're all throughout the community. Yeah. There's multiples of them, right. There's a temple and then there's synagogues. And so the temple is the true, house of worship, the place of sacrifice, but the synagogue operates as a place of kind of worship for the community, or a place to go and hear rabbis do teaching or community events. It even becomes a place where there's like business meetings that take place amongst Jewish leaders there. And so it's kind of like a Jewish community center that is throughout each district that people go to, primarily to sit under Jewish teaching, and most often go to on a Sabbath day because they're free, and then they show up there. And so this is where our story is taking place.
Yeah. So it's kind of like little churches that you would say, like just little gathering places, and then there's like the big place.
Yeah, and that's why I think, again, like there's no, the temple, the temple of the Spirit's in the heart of every believer today. So there's no like singular temple. Yeah. But I think this is why there's so many parallels to Mark chapter 3 and church attendance. I listen again in my prep for preaching for sermons. I tend to write my entire sermon out before I listen to anyone else deliver it, because I want to be careful that I'm not just going to like take someone else's words and interject them into my sermon. And as I got to the end of this week, what I found was the most common way for people to apply this passage to the church today is that the synagogues almost kind of operate like little churches. And you can look at each character in this story and you can see how they're almost representatives of different ways that people attend church, or why they attend church, or what happens. And so, so we landed really heavily on the Pharisees yesterday, but I think it was very common for people to go, who does the withered hand represent? Who do the Pharisees represent? Why are people going to the synagogue? Yeah. What is their heart in attending this, in attending this, religious gathering? And then how does that parallel with our hearts today?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And so, let's talk a little bit about this man with the withered hand. Yeah. What is he doing there? Is he even allowed there? I know, in the temple, there's certain areas that you can and cannot go. Yeah. I'm assuming the synagogue would be more of an open gathering. You're allowed to come in, but
I think he's allowed to come in, but I think you could parallel this with some of the past passages that we've seen where it's, how would people view this man when he's entering the synagogue? So, is his ailment, this is the term I keep using. It's hard to say injury or ailment, or it's not really, probably not a disease, but is it, are people looking at him and they're viewing that this is something that he brought upon himself due to his sin?
Right.
That's a weight that he's probably under as he's entering, the synagogue each and every week. That's one option. But the reality is, like, he is likely there for the same reason everybody else is. It's a Sabbath day, and he's there to sit under rabbinical teaching and learn and grow more in his knowledge of God through the teaching of the Torah. Right. And so, that's what he's there for. The uniqueness is just the simple fact that, like, he's there and this withered hand is at least noticeable enough that it catches Jesus' eye and the Pharisees.
Yeah, they all know. Yeah, that's good. So, like, he would be the outcast that we've been talking about. Like the leper, the tax collector, etc. Like, this is the outcast of the story. And it says that the Pharisees are there. I almost see them, like, over in the corner in the shadows, like, just trying to watch. Like, talk a little bit about what's going on here.
Yeah, it's what they say is the text says in it. It says that they are watching him,
right?
Which is why we get this visual picture that they're just kind of in the corner and they're looking to see what Jesus is. And they've been watching him. We see that in the dinner party scene, that it's like, it's almost like they're right outside the doors of the party, just watching to see, why is Jesus hanging out with these people?
Yeah.
But they're there as well, which also makes sense because it's a Sabbath day, and they see that Jesus happens to be at the synagogue. They have knowledge of who he is.
They're probably the typical teachers on this day.
Yeah. And you have to think, have to think too, like, so when we say synagogue, so last week's story took place on a Sabbath day and it took place in a field. The last passage we were in, the end of chapter 2. This is another Sabbath day. And so many authors believe that it's the following Sabbath day. And it's not, it's Jesus is probably somewhere in the same proximity in town, but it obviously he's not in a field. And so now we get to see Jesus actually living out the truths that he told them in the last passage. Right. So they know who Jesus is. They see him here.
Yeah.
And now the events are about to unfold.
Yeah. So Jesus sees this man with the withered hand. He says, "Come here." And then he directs his gaze at them, which I believe is referring to the Pharisees.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be referring to everyone in the room, but he's, I think, specifically talking to the Pharisees.
And keep in mind, they've not really addressed him yet.
Right.
Yeah.
They're just watching.
Yes.
And he asks them this question: is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill it? Now, before we get to the response, like, where is that coming from? Like, is there anything in Jewish culture that would have said this?
So if I were to be grading myself from the sermon that we gave yesterday, this is one part that I think I could have been a little bit more clear on.
Okay.
So the Old Testament law as it relates to Sabbath is essentially do not do work. And I said, even more clearly, it's like, don't do your job. So now, as you would break down Jewish law farther, it would have specifications for, like, a medical practitioner or a doctor on when are they allowed to heal someone and when are they not. And so this is what Jesus is referencing here. He's referencing that within Jewish law, that a doctor would be allowed to go heal someone if it was a injury or something that was potentially leading them to being at risk of dying. Right. That was like that. And so Jesus is saying, is it not lawful for me to save a life or to kill? And so what he's referencing is that there is room to do work if it's life threatening.
Yeah. So then their response.
Yeah.
It's almost like the phrase, the silence is deafening.
Yeah.
Like, it just says they were silent.
Yeah. I think you could cut the tension with a knife.
Yeah.
Like that phrase would be very fitting for this.
Yeah.
Because here's the reality. This man with a withered hand, we don't have details in any of the Gospels that his injury or his ailment, again, is life-threatening.
Right.
It's actually probably not life-threatening. Now, it's debilitating.
Yeah.
And they're not moved with compassion, and that's why Jesus is so angry. And so that's why I was sharing yesterday to the church that what we really should see here is that while they're trying to catch Jesus in a trap, saying that you helped this man on the Sabbath, and they're frustrated about it.
Yeah.
Maybe because his injury is not life-threatening. Maybe that's why they go and run.
Maybe.
The thing is, it's that Jesus himself, he's not One, what did we say the rule is? It's don't do work.
Right. Don't do your job.
Yeah, don't do your job. And let's even say it's just don't do work.
Yeah.
Like you shouldn't expend energy and you should rest. Well, how much energy does Jesus expend in this passage?
He talks.
Yeah, he doesn't do anything, right. And so that would be like, again, if I was like, I'm not Jesus's lawyer, but if I was right. Jesus's lawyer, I think that would be my primary argument is like, he actually didn't do any work. And this helped me kind of reinterpret the end of chapter 2 as we were working through it. So verse 2:27 says, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Yeah. Okay, last week we were taking that verse and we were applying it, saying that if the Sabbath does not lead us towards God and towards worship and towards godliness, then it's not serving its purpose. That's absolutely true. Yeah. But there's another reading of that's like just reading it at face value that says the Sabbath was made for man. Yeah. Meaning the Sabbath was not made for Jesus. It was not made for the God man. And so here, when we see Jesus act in the story, they're trying to confine him by a system that he's not confined by. And this is some of what we learn about Jesus is that Jesus is going to step in and serve and help whomever, whenever he pleases. He's not ignoring God's law. He's not even trying to go against God's design for the Sabbath or say the Sabbath is a bad thing. Yeah. Something that's interesting this week, I don't know, like if anyone in our church, some people are obviously, but like we have a church TikTok. Maybe you knew that, maybe you didn't. But surprise. Yeah. So when we post clips over the last few weeks from the TikTok, we're finding a large audience of either Jewish individuals or people who are commenting on our post. And they're saying, yeah, but are you maintaining the Sabbath? And they're being very legalistic. They're saying things like as the sixth day of the week, all sorts of stuff. But it's interesting because it's like, I don't think Jesus is as interested here with trying to correct their view of the Sabbath. I don't think he's interested with trying to break their view of the Sabbath. He sees the benefit and the beauty of the Sabbath. Yes. But rather, he's frustrated that they're not being moved with compassion.
Yeah. I think what he's trying to do is actually show them the correct interpretation of what the law actually says. Yeah. So like if we were to back up and just look at the last 3 sections that we did, he's been pounding the same point home over and over and over again. And it's that the law is not about restriction. Yes. It's about restoration. Yeah. And so like he talks about that when it came to fasting. Like it's not about restricting and doing all these things. It's about trusting in him, trusting in his restorative power.
Yeah. And leading you, being able to believe that you can rest because God's God.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the point of the Sabbath. That's why I asked my kids at the dinner table the other day, I was like, so we learned about Sabbath and they were like, yeah. And I said, okay, if God created the earth in 6 days and then on the 7th day he rested, why did he rest? Does God need to rest? No. And they were like, no. I was like, then why did he do it? And they were like, because he wants us to do it. Like he's showing us the pattern
exactly
of like, after you do your work, trust that that's enough. Like trust in the God who said, I've created this earth and it is good. Yeah. And that is enough.
And so basically what I'm saying is like, when I'm saying Jesus is not confined by the Sabbath, I'm saying because he is God in himself. Right. Now, what I'm not trying to say is that Jesus believes the Sabbath is beneficial.
Right. He just said that.
He would want people to practice the Sabbath. Yeah. And so if Christians, you look and you go, oh, that's an Old Testament thing. Like, I don't need to rest. I'm a 7-day-a-week work guy. Like, that's what it's going to be. It'd be like, no. Jesus would say that's not good. Yeah. But the reality is Jesus is also standing here in the flesh, sees a man in which needs his help. Yeah. And he's moved with compassion. And even more than that, he's motivated by looking at humanity, because the Pharisees, like, they're not the opposition party in the sense that like Jesus hates them. Or they're his enemy. They're not his enemy. No. These are created image bearers. And he's just so frustrated that they're not living out the Imago Dei. They're not living out the image of God appropriately. And even God giving them instruction for their benefit, they've now misinterpreted it. And it's led them all the way to the point in which that they're being so unloving to someone right before their eyes. And I think that's what applies to us today.
Yeah.
Like if for some reason, and this is true of people, like let's just all say that we can believe that. If for some reason your faith and practice and belief in Jesus has led you to a point in which that you're like unloving and hateful towards other people, or don't want to even see their redemption, I don't know that you're walking with Jesus. Like that's what these stories allude. Like it's became something else.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole point is, it's to love others and do good. But is it not lawful to do good?
Yeah.
The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Shouldn't we be doing good instead of letting other people suffer? Like that's kind of what
and that's why I think the heart challenge is so important for us, is like, we need, it's not, we're going to get nowhere by looking at all the people that we see that are unloving and going, hey, they need to be more loving. No, we need to look at ourselves and go, where in my life have I became so callous that I'm not drawn towards compassion when someone's in front of me, or I care more about proving a point than being obedient, or I'd rather see that person's demise than I would love to see them, be forgiven and walk in the Lord. And it's like, that's inside all of us a little bit. In some ways, it's even so terrible that it's even built off of our desire to live righteously and seek God. And it can just make us, I heard someone say this recently. They said, and we'd have to unpack this a little bit, but they said, if you've became a Christian that could not reach yourself with the gospel, there's a problem. Yeah. And I think we're just at risk of that. We're at risk of becoming the separate ones.
Yeah.
And not being people that actually are moved with love and compassion towards all people that we interact with.
Yeah. I mean, they're so stuck on their traditions and their legalism in here that they can't even see the people that need help there in the same room.
Yeah. And I thought it was cool this week. Again, it was new to me. It was the benefit of using biblical commentaries in prep, but like just to read the Acts 15 passage where it's like some of these very same people that seem so stuck in their waves are later in Acts, which again is Luke and Acts were one volume. Yeah. It was one book. And so it's a continuation of the gospel narrative as Jesus is working through the church and the power of the Holy Spirit. And in Acts 15, it's like even some of these same Pharisees that you believe almost could never change their viewpoint are professed to be believers. Yeah. Now they're still legalistic. They're still wrestling.
It's hard to shake that out.
Yeah, it's like they're still wrestling with it.
Yeah.
Which again, I think also gives us hope that like, while God's constantly redeeming our heart, there's some issues that we're going to be working on for a while.
I mean, to quote us from a few weeks ago, no one is ever too far gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, and even when they do come to Christ, there's still going to be things that are going to need to be worked out.
Yeah. And I think it's cool too, to parallel that. Like we need to wrestle with that. And like no one is ever too far gone is true. While also what is true is that no one is righteous, not one.
That's right.
And so it's like if you're leaning towards self-righteousness, thinking that, oh, I'm good enough, you're missing it. And then if you're leaning towards I'm unable to be picked up out of this pit, you're missing it. In fact, both of those statements are true at the same time. Because again, our worth and our righteousness is not in ourselves, it's in the work of Jesus.
That's right. Yeah. That's good stuff. Well, I think that's where we conclude today. Thanks for joining us for the Sermon Recap Podcast. We will see you next time.